Section 33 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 11. Edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Great Civil War in England. Charles Knight. The drawbridge of Hurst Castle is lowered during the night, December 17th, 1648, and the tramp of a troop of horse is heard by the wakeful prisoner. He calls for his attendant, Herbert, who is sent to ascertain the cause of this midnight commotion. Major Harrison is arrived. The king is agitated. He has been warned that Harrison is a man chosen to assassinate him. He is reassured in the morning in being informed that the Major and his troop are to conduct him to Windsor. 2 days after, the king sets out under the escort of Lieutenant Colonel Cobbett. At Winchester, he is received in state by the mayor and aldermen, but they retire alarmed on being told that the House has voted all to be traitors, who should address the king. The troop commanded by Cobbett has been relieved on the route by another troop, of which Harrison has the command. They rest at Farnham. Charles expresses to Harrison, with whose soldierly appearance he is struck, the suspicions which had been hinted regarding him. The Major, in his new buff coat and fringed scarf of crimson silk, told the king that he needed not to entertain any such imagination or apprehension, that the Parliament had too much honour and justice to cherish so foul an intention, and assured him that whatever the Parliament resolved to do would be very public, and in a way of justice to which the world should be witness, and would never endure a thought of secret violence. This, adds Clarendon, His Majesty could not persuade himself to believe, nor did imagine that they durst ever produce him in the sight of the people, under any form whatsoever of a public trial. The next day the journey was pursued toward Windsor. The king urged his desire to stop at Bagshot, and dine in the forest at the house of Lord Newborough. He had been apprised that his friend would have ready for him a horse of extraordinary fleetness, with which he might make one more effort to escape. The horse had been kicked by another horse the day before and was useless. That last faint hope was gone. On the night of December 23rd, the king slept, a prisoner surrounded with hostile guards, in the noble castle which in the days of his youth had rung with Jonson's lyrics and ribaldry, and the gipsy of the mask had prophesied that his name in peace or wars naught should bound. But even here he continued to cherish some of the delusions which he had indulged in situations of far less danger. He was still surrounded with something of regal pomp. He dined, as the ancient sovereigns had dined, in public, as Elizabeth and his father and he himself had dined, seated under a canopy, the cup presented to him on the knee, the dishes solemnly tasted before he ate. These manifestations of respect he held to be indicative of an altered feeling. But he also had an undoubting confidence that he should be righted by aid from Ireland, from Denmark, from other kingdoms. I have 3 more cards to play, the worst of which will give me back everything. After 3 weeks of comparative comfort, the etiquette observed toward him was laid aside, and with a fearful sense of approaching calamity in the absence of respect and honour according to the ancient practice, is there anything more contemptible than a despised prince? During the month in which Charles had remained at Windsor, there had been proceedings in Parliament of which he was imperfectly informed. On the day he arrived there, it was resolved by the Commons that he should be brought to trial. On January the 2nd, 1649, it was voted that, in making war against the Parliament, he had been guilty of treason, and the High Court was appointed to try him. 150 commissioners were to compose the court, peers, members of the Commons, aldermen of London. The ordinance was sent to the Upper House and was rejected. On the 6th, a fresh ordinance declaring that the people being, after God, the source of all just power, the representatives of the people are the supreme power in the nation, and that whatsoever is enacted or declared for law by the Commons in Parliament hath the force of a law, and the people are concluded thereby, though the consent of king or peers be not had thereto. Asserting this power, so utterly opposed either to the ancient constitution of the monarchy or to the possible working of a republic, there was no hesitation in constituting the High Court of Justice in the name of the Commons alone. The number of members of the court was now reduced to 135. They had 7 preparatory meetings, at which only 58 members attended. All men, says Mrs. Hutchinson, were left to their free liberty of acting, neither persuaded nor compelled, and as there were some nominated in a commission who never sat, and others who sat at first but durst not hold on, so all the rest might have declined it if they would, when it is apparent they should have suffered nothing by so doing. Algernon Sidney, although bent upon a republic, opposed the trial, apprehending that the project of a commonwealth would fail if the king's life were touched. It is related that Cromwell, irritated by these scruples, exclaimed, "No one will stir, I tell you, we will cut his head off with the crown upon it." Such daring may appear the result of ambition, or fear, or revenge, or innate cruelty in a few men who had obtained a temporary ascendancy. These men were, on the contrary, the organs of a widespread determination among thousands throughout the country, who had long preached and argued and prophesied about vengeance on the great delinquent, and who had ever in their mouths the text, that blood defileth the land, and the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed therein, but by the blood of him that shed it. They had visions of a theocracy, and were impatient of an earthly king. Do we believe, as some, not without reasonable grounds, may believe, that the members of the High Court of Justice expressed such convictions upon a simulated religious confidence? Do we think that, in the clear line of action which Cromwell especially had laid down for his guidance, he cloaked his worldly ambition under the guise of being moved by some higher impulse than that of taking the lead in a political revolution? Certainly we do not. The infinite mischiefs of assuming that the finger of God directly points out the way to believers when they are walking in dangerous and devious paths may be perfectly clear to us who calmly look back upon the instant events which followed upon Cromwell's confidence in his solemn call to a fearful duty. But we are not the more to believe because the events have a character of guilt in the views of most persons, that such a declared conviction was altogether, or in any degree, a lie. Those were times in which, more for good than for evil, men believed in the immediate direction of a special providence in great undertakings. The words, "God hath given us the victory," were not with them a mere form. If we trace amid these solemn impulses the workings of a deep sagacity, the union of the fierce resolves of a terrible enthusiasm with the foresight and energy of an ever-present common sense, we are not the more to conclude that their spiritualism or fanaticism, or whatever we please to call their ruling principle, was less sincere by being mixed up with the ordinary motives through which the affairs of the world are carried on. Indeed, when we look to the future course of English history and see, as those who have no belief in a higher direction of the destiny of nations than that of human wisdom can alone turn away from seeing, that the inscrutable workings of a supreme power led our country, in the fullness of time, to internal peace and security after these storms, and in a great degree in consequence of them, can we refuse our belief that the tragical events of those days were ordered for our good? Acknowledging that the overthrow of a rotten throne was necessary for the building up of a throne that should have its sole stable foundation in the welfare of the people, can we affirm that the men who did the mightier portion of that work, sternly, unflinchingly, illegally, yet ever professing to seek to know the mind of God in all that chain of providence, are quite correctly described in the statute for their attainder as a party of wretched men, desperately wicked and hardened in their impiety? On January 19th, Major Harrison appeared again at Windsor with his troop. There was a coach with 6 horses in the courtyard, in which the king took his seat, and, once more, he entered London, and was lodged at St. James's Palace. The next day, the High Court of Justice was opened in Westminster Hall. The king came from St. James's in a sedan, and after the names of the members of the court had been called, 69 being present, Bradshaw, the president, ordered the sergeant to bring in the prisoner. Silently the king sat down in the chair prepared for him. He moved not his hat as he looked sternly and contemptuously around. The 69 rose not from their seats and remained covered. It is scarcely 8 years since he was a spectator of the last solemn trial in this hall, that of Strafford. What mighty events have happened since that time! There are memorials hanging from the roof which tell such a history as his saddest fears in the hour of Strafford's death could scarcely have shaped out. The tattered banners taken from his cavaliers at Marston Moor and Naseby are floating above his head. There, too, are the same memorials of Preston, but still he looks around him, proudly and severely. Who are the men who are to judge him? The king, who, united in his person every possible claim, by hereditary right to the English as well as the Scottish throne, being the heir both of Egbert and William the Conqueror. These men are, in his view, traitors and rebels, from Bradshaw the lawyer, who sits in the foremost chair, calling himself Lord President, to Cromwell and Martin in the back seat, over whose heads are the Red Cross of England and the Harp of Ireland, painted on an escutcheon, while the proud bearings of a line of kings are nowhere visible. Under what law does this insolent president address him as Charles Stuart, King of England, and say, "The Commons of England, being deeply sensible of the calamities that have been brought upon this nation, which are fixed upon you as the principal author of them, have resolved to make inquisition for blood"? He will defy their authority. The clerk reads the charge, and when he is accused therein of being tyrant and traitor, he laughs in the face of the court. Though his tongue usually hesitated, yet it was very free at this time, for he was never discomposed in his mind, writes Warwick, and yet, it is added, as he confessed himself to the Bishop of London that attended him, one action shocked him very much, for while he was leaning in the court upon his staff, which had a head of gold, the head broke off on a sudden. He took it up, but seemed unconcerned, yet told the bishop it really made a great impression upon him. It was the symbol of the treacherous hopes upon which he had rested, golden dreams that vanished in this solemn hour. Again and again, contending against the authority of the court, the king was removed, and the sitting was adjourned to the 22nd. On that day the same scene was renewed, and again on the 23rd. A growing sympathy for the monarch became apparent. The cries of "Justice! Justice!" which were heard at first were now mingled with "God save the king!" He had refused to plead, but the court nevertheless employed the 24th and 25th of January in collecting evidence to prove the charge of his levying war against the Parliament. Coke, the Solicitor General, then demanded whether the court would proceed to pronouncing the sentence, and the members adjourned to the Painted Chamber. On the 27th, the public sitting was resumed. When the name of Fairfax was called, a voice was heard from the gallery. "He has too much wit to be here." The king was brought in, and when the president addressed the commissioners and said that the prisoner was before the court to answer a charge of high treason and other crimes brought against him in the name of the people of England, the voice from the gallery was again heard. "It's a lie, not one half of them." The voice came from Lady Fairfax. The court, Bradshaw then stated, had agreed upon the sentence. Ludlow records that the king desired to make one proposition before they proceeded to sentence, which he earnestly pressing as that which he thought would lead to the reconciling of all parties, and to the peace of the three kingdoms, they permitted him to offer it. The effect of which was that he might meet the two houses in the Painted Chamber, to whom he doubted not to offer that which should satisfy and secure all interests. Ludlow goes on to say, designing, as I have been since informed, to propose his own resignation, and the admission of his son to the throne upon such terms as should have been agreed upon. The commissioners retired to deliberate, and being satisfied upon debate that nothing but loss of time would be the consequence of it, they returned into the court with a negative to his demand. Bradshaw then delivered a solemn speech to the king, declaring how he had through his reign endeavoured to subvert the laws and introduce arbitrary government, how he had attempted from the beginning either to destroy parliaments or to render them subservient to his own designs, how he had levied war against the Parliament by the terror of his power to discourage forever such assemblies from doing their duty, and that in this war many thousands of the good people of England had lost their lives. The clerk was lastly commanded to read the sentence, that his head should be severed from his body, and the commissioners, says Ludlow, testified their unanimous assent by standing up. The king attempted to speak, but being accounted dead in law, was not permitted. On January 29th, the court met to sign the sentence of execution, addressed to Colonel Francis Hacker, Colonel Hunks, and Lieutenant Colonel Phayer, and to every one of them. This is the memorable document. Whereas Charles Stuart, King of England, is and standeth convicted, attainted and condemned of high treason and other crimes, and sentence upon Saturday last was pronounced against him by this court, to be put to death by the severing of his head from his body, of which sentence execution remaineth to be done. These are therefore to will and require you to see the said sentence executed in the open street before Whitehall, upon the morrow, being the 30th day of this instant month of January, between the hours of 10 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon, with full effect. And for so doing, this shall be your warrant. And these are to require all officers and soldiers, and others the good people of this nation of England, to be assisting unto you in this service. Given under our hands and seals, John Bradshaw, Thomas Gray, Oliver Cromwell, and 56 others. The statements of the heartless buffoonery and the daring violence of Cromwell at the time of the signing the warrant must be received with some suspicion. He smeared Henry Marten's face with the ink of his pen, and Marten in return smeared his, say the narratives. Probably so. With reference to this anecdote, it has been wisely observed, such toys of desperation commonly bubble up from a deep-flowing stream below. Another anecdote is told by Clarendon, that Colonel Ingoldsby, one who signed the warrant, was forced to do so with great violence by Cromwell and others, and Cromwell, with a loud laughter, taking his hand in his and putting the pen between his fingers, with his own hand, writ Richard Ingoldsby, he making all the resistance he could. Ingoldsby gave this relation in the desire to obtain a pardon after the Restoration, and to confirm his story, he said, if his name there were compared with what he had ever writ himself, it could never be looked upon as his own hand. Warburton, in a note upon this passage, says, the original warrant is still extant, and Ingoldsby's name has no such mark of its being wrote in that manner. The king knew his fate. He resigned himself to it with calmness and dignity, with one exceptional touch of natural human passion, when he said to Bishop Juxon, although resigning himself to meet his God, "We will not talk of these rogues, in whose hands I am. They thirst for my blood, and they will have it, and God's will be done. I thank God. I heartily forgive them, and I will talk of them no more." He took an affectionate leave of his daughter, the Princess Elizabeth, 12 years old, and of his son, the Duke of Gloucester, of the age of 8. To him he said, "Mark, child, what I say. They will cut off my head, and perhaps make thee king. But thou must not be king so long as thy brothers Charles and James live." And the child said, "I will be torn in pieces first." There were some attempts to save him. The Dutch ambassador made vigorous efforts to procure a reprieve, while the French and Spanish ambassadors were inert. The ambassadors from the States nevertheless persevered, and early in the day of the 30th obtained some glimmering of hope from Fairfax. "But we found," they say in their dispatch, "in front of the house in which we had just spoken with the general, about 200 horsemen, and we learned, as well on our way as on reaching home, that all the streets, passages, and squares of London were occupied by troops, so that no one could pass, and that the approaches of the city were covered with cavalry, so as to prevent anyone from coming in or going out." The same day, between 2 and 3 o'clock, the king was taken to a scaffold covered with black, erected before Whitehall. To that scaffold before Whitehall Charles walked, surrounded by soldiers, through the leafless avenues of St. James's Park. It was a bitterly cold morning. Evelyn records that the Thames was frozen over. The season was so sharp that the king asked to have a shirt more than ordinary when he carefully dressed himself. He left St. James's at 10 o'clock. He remained in his chamber at Whitehall for about 3 hours in prayer, and then received the sacrament. He was pressed to dine, but refused, taking a piece of bread and a glass of wine. His purposed address to the people was delivered only to the hearing of those upon the scaffold, but its purport was that the people mistook the nature of government, for people are free under a government, not by being sharers in it, but by due administration of the laws of it. His theory of government was a consistent one. He had the misfortune not to understand that the time had been fast passing away for its assertion. The headsman did his office, and a deep groan went up from the surrounding multitude. It is scarcely necessary that we should offer any opinion upon this tremendous event. The world had never before seen an act so daring conducted with such a calm determination, and the few moderate men of that time balanced the illegality and also the impolicy of the execution of Charles by the fact that it was not done in a corner, and those who directed or sanctioned the act offered no apology, but maintained its absolute necessity and justice. That horrible sentence upon the most innocent person in the world, the execution of that sentence by the most execrable murder that was ever committed since that of our blessed Saviour, forms the text which Clarendon gave for the rhapsodies of party during 2 centuries. On the other hand, The eloquent address of Milton to the people of England has been in the hearts and mouths of many who have known that the establishment of the liberties of their country, duly subordinated by the laws of a free monarchy, may be dated from this event. God has endued you with the greatness of mind to be the first of mankind, who, after having conquered their own king, and having had him delivered into their hands, have not scrupled to condemn him judicially, and, pursuant to that sentence of condemnation, to put him to death. In these times in England, when the welfare of the throne and the people are identical, we can, on the one hand, afford to refuse our assent to the blasphemous comparison of Clarendon, blasphemy more offensively repeated in the church service for January 30th, and at the same time affirm that the judicial condemnation which Milton so admires was illegal, unconstitutional, and, in its immediate results, dangerous to liberty. But feeling that far greater dangers would have been incurred if the caged tiger had been let loose, and knowing that out of the errors and anomalies of those times a wiser revolution grew, for which the first, more terrible revolution was a preparation, we may cease to examine this great historical question in any bitterness of spirit, and even acknowledge that the death of Charles, a bad king, though in some respects a good man, was necessary for the life of England, and for her teaching other nations how to live. We must accept as just and true Milton's admonition to his countrymen in reference to this event, which he terms so glorious an action, with many reasonable qualifications as to its glory, and yet apply even to ourselves his majestic words. After the performing so glorious an action as this, you ought to do nothing that is mean and little, not so much as to think of, much less to do, anything, but what is great and sublime, which to attain to, this is your only way, as you have subdued your enemies in the field, so to make appear that unarmed and in the highest outward peace and tranquillity, you of all mankind are best able to subdue ambition, avarice, the love of riches, and can best avoid the corruptions that prosperity is apt to introduce, which generally subdue and triumph over other nations, to show us great justice, temperance, and moderation in the maintaining your liberty, as you have shown courage in freeing yourselves from slavery. End of section 33. Read by Bryn Roberts. Kingswinford, January 2023.
Section 34 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 11, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Cromwell's Campaign in Ireland, A.D. 1649, by Frederic Harrison. Editor's Introduction. Alike on account of its effect upon the Irish people and by reason of the historical debate of which it has continued to be the subject, Cromwell's Irish campaign is a matter of much moment to students of British policy and conquest. Cromwell had already won a complete victory for the parliamentary forces over the royalists of England and Scotland, and had suppressed an insurrection in Wales. As a member of the High Court he had signed the death warrant of Charles I, and on the establishment of the Commonwealth, early in 1649, his preeminence in both military and political leadership gave him almost absolute control of the English government. In 1641 there had been a Catholic uprising in Ireland which was attended with considerable success, one at the cost of slaughter often characterized as massacre. Although Charles I made peace with the insurrectionists in 1643, and soon afterward most of them became royalists, disorders in Ireland still continued. At last the English Parliament resolved to put an end to these tumults, and in March 1649 Cromwell was appointed to the supreme command in Ireland. Among the many able writers on Oliver Cromwell, none has treated this portion of his career with greater clearness and impartiality than Frederic Harrison, whose history of the campaign in Ireland has been selected, particularly for the sake of these merits, for presentation here. End of introduction. The reconquest of Ireland was by all felt to be the most urgent interest of the young Commonwealth. There was almost as much agreement to entrust Cromwell with the task. And after some consideration and prayerful consultations in the army, he accepted the duty. The condition of England was precarious indeed. Service in Ireland was not popular in the army, and an ambitious adventurer would have been loath to quit England while the first place was still unoccupied. It was at great risk to the cause and at much personal sacrifice that Cromwell accepted the difficult post in Ireland as his first duty to his country and to religion. His campaign and the subsequent settlement in Ireland are among those things which weigh heaviest on Cromwell's memory, and which of his stoutest admirers one only has heartily approved. Fortunately, there is no part of his policy where his conduct is more simple and his motives are more plain. The Irish policy of Cromwell was the traditional policy of all Englishmen of his creed and party, and was distinguished from theirs only by his personal vigor and thoroughness. He was neither better nor worse than the English Puritans, or rather all English statesmen for many generations. He was only keener and stronger. When he, with Vane, Fairfax, Whitelock, and other commissioners, went to the Guildhall to obtain a loan for the campaign, they told the Common Council that this was a struggle not between Independent and Presbyterian, but between Papist and Protestant, that papacy or popery was not to be endured in that kingdom, and they cited the maxim of James I. Plant Ireland with Puritans, root out Papists, and then secure it. To Cromwell, as to all English Puritans, it seemed a self-evident truth that one of the three realms could not be suffered to become Catholic. As little could it be suffered to become independent, or the open practice of the Catholic religion allowed there, any more than in England. Finally, that peace and prosperity could never be secured in Ireland without a dominant and preponderating order of English birth and Protestant belief. By Cromwell, as by the whole Puritan body, we may fairly say by the whole body of Protestants, the Irish rebellion of 1641 was believed to have opened with a barbarous, treacherous, and wholesale massacre, followed during 9 years by one prolonged scene of confusion and bloodshed, ending in an almost complete extinction of the Protestant faith and English interests. The victorious party, and Cromwell more deeply than others, entered on the recovery of Ireland in the spirit of a religious war, to restore to the Protestant cause one of the three realms which had revolted to the powers of darkness. Such was for centuries the spirit of Protestant England. 5 months were occupied in the preparations for this distant and difficult campaign. Cromwell's nomination was on March 15, 1649. On the same day, Milton was appointed Latin secretary to the council. During April, Cromwell arranged the marriage of his eldest son with the daughter of a very quiet, unambitious squire. On July 10th he set forth from London with much military state. His lifeguard was a body of gentlemen, as is hardly to be paralleled in the world. He still waited a month in the West, his wife and family around him, and thence wrote his beautiful letter to Mayer about his son, and the letter to my beloved daughter Dorothy Cromwell at Hursley. At length all was ready, and he set sail on August 13th with 9,000 men in about 100 ships. He was invested with supreme civil as well as military command in Ireland, amply supplied with material and a fleet. Ireton, his son-in-law, was his second in command. On landing in Dublin, the general made a speech to the people in which he spoke of his purpose as the great work against the barbarous and bloodthirsty Irish and all their adherents and confederates, for the propagating of the gospel of Christ, the establishing of truth and peace, and restoring that bleeding nation to its former happiness and tranquillity. His first act was to remodel the Irish army, making a huge purge of the army which we found here. It was an army made up of dissolute and debauched men. And the general issued a proclamation against swearing and drunkenness, and another against the wickedness that had been taken by the soldiery, to abuse, rob, and pillage, and too often to execute cruelties upon the country people, promising to protect all peaceable inhabitants, and to pay them in ready money for all goods. 2 soldiers were shortly hanged for disobeying these orders. Having made a general muster of his forces in Dublin, and formed a complete body of 15,000 horse and foot, he selected a force of 10,000 stout resolute men, and advanced on Drogheda, in English Tredaw. Drogheda is a seaport town on the Boyne, about 23 miles due north of Dublin. It was strongly fortified, and Ormond, as Clarendon tells us, had put into it the flower of his army, both of soldiers and officers, most of them English, to the number of 3,000 foot, and 2 or 3 good troops of horse, provided with all things. Sir Arthur Ashton, an English Catholic, an officer of great name and experience, and who at that time made little doubt of defending it against all the power of Cromwell, was in chief command. Cromwell's horse reached Drogheda on September 3rd, his memorable day. Some skirmishes followed, and on the 10th the batteries opened in earnest, after formal summons to the garrison to surrender. A steeple and a tower were beaten down the first day. All through the 11th the batteries continued, and at length effected 2 reasonable breaches. About 5 in the evening of the second day the storm began. After some hot dispute we entered, about 700 or 800 men, the enemy disputing it very stiffly with us. But a tremendous rally of the garrison, wherein Colonel Castle and other officers were killed, drove out the column, which retreated disheartened and baffled. Then the general did that which as commander he was seldom wont to do, and which he passes in silence in his dispatches. Resolved, says Ludlow, to put all upon it, he went down to the breach, and calling out a fresh reserve of Colonel Ewer's men, he put himself at their head, and with the word, Our Lord God, led them up again with courage and resolution, though they met with a hot dispute. Thus encouraged to recover their loss, they got ground of the enemy, forced him to quit his entrenchments, and poured into the town. There many retreated to the Mill Mount, a place very strong and difficult of access, exceedingly high and strongly palisaded. This place commanded the whole town. Thither Sir Arthur Ashton and other important officers had betaken themselves. But the storming party burst in, and were ordered by Cromwell to put them all to the sword. The rest of the garrison fled over the bridge to the northern side of the town, but the Ironsides followed them hotly, both horse and foot, and drove them into St. Peter's Church and the towers of the ramparts. St. Peter's Church was set on fire by Cromwell's order. He writes to the Speaker, Indeed, being in the heat of action, I forbade them to spare any that were in arms in the town, and I think that night they put to the sword about 2,000 men. Next day the other towers were summoned, and the work of slaughter was renewed for 2 days, until the entire garrison was annihilated. It was unquestionably a massacre. That night they put to the sword about 2,000 men. In St. Peter's Church, near 1,000 of them were put to the sword, fleeing thither for safety. Their friars were knocked on the head promiscuously. I do not think we lost 100 men upon the place. Such are a few passages from Cromwell's own dispatches. The slaughter was indeed prodigious. The general writes, "I believe we put to the sword the whole number of the defendants. I do not think 30 of the whole number escaped with their lives. The enemy were about 3,000 strong in the town. I do not believe, neither do I hear, that any officer escaped with his life, save only one lieutenant." He subsequently gives a detailed list of the slain, amounting to about 3,000. Hugh Peters, the chaplain, reports as follows. "Sir, the truth is, Drogheda is taken, 3,552 of the enemy slain, and 64 of ours. Ashton the governor killed, none spared. It is also certain that quarter was refused. I forbade them to spare any that were in arms in the town. It is expressly told us that all officers and all priests taken were killed. From the days of Clarendon it has been repeated by historians that men, women, and children were indiscriminately slaughtered, and there is evidence of an eyewitness to that effect, but this is not believed to have been done by the order or even with the knowledge of the general. The royalist accounts insist that quarter was promised at first, and that the butchery of men in cold blood was carried on for days. Here again the act must have been exceptional and without authority. To Cromwell himself this fearful slaughter was a signal triumph of the truth. "It hath pleased God to bless our endeavours. This hath been a marvellous great mercy. I am persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches who have imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood, and that it will tend to prevent the effusion of blood for the future, which are the satisfactory grounds to such actions, which otherwise cannot but work remorse and regret. It was set upon some of our hearts that a great thing should be done, not by power or might, but by the Spirit of God. In the same sense it was received by Parliament and Council of State, by some of the noblest spirits of their age." Ludlow says simply that this extraordinary severity was used to discourage others from making opposition. It had always been the policy of Cromwell in battle to inflict a crushing defeat. At Marston, at Naseby, and at Preston he had taken execution of the enemy for hours and over miles of country. At Basing and elsewhere, after a summons and a storm, he had slaughtered hundreds without mercy. And such was the law of war in that age, practiced on both sides without hesitation. But the item of numbers and of time tells very heavily here. The killing of hundreds in hot blood differs from the massacre of thousands during days. There was no such act in the whole Civil War as the massacre, prolonged for days, of 3,000 men enclosed in walls entirely at the mercy of their captors, to say nothing of the promiscuous slaughter of priests, if not of women and unarmed men. In England such a deed could not have been done, and not in Ireland, but that they were Catholics fighting in defence of their faith. The fact that the garrison were Catholics, fighting on Irish soil, placed them, to the Puritan Englishmen, out of the pale. No admiration for Cromwell, for his genius, courage, and earnestness, no sympathy with the cause that he upheld in England, can blind us to the truth that the lurid light of this great crime burns still after centuries across the history of England and of Ireland, that it is one of those damning charges which the Puritan theology has yet to answer at the bar of humanity. The tremendous blow at Drogheda struck terror into Ormond's forces. Dundalk and Trim were abandoned in haste. O'Neill swore a great oath that as Cromwell had stormed Drogheda, if he should storm hell he should take it. One fort after another yielded, and in a fortnight from the taking of Drogheda, Cromwell was master of the country north of Dublin. Marching from Dublin south, on September 23rd, his army took forts in Wicklow, Arklow, and Enniscorthy, and on October 1st the general encamped before Wexford an important seaport at the southeastern corner of the island. The town was strong, with a rampart 15 feet thick, a garrison of over 2,000 men, 100 cannon, and in the harbor 2 ships armed with 54 guns. Cromwell summoned the governor to surrender, not obscurely threatening him with the fate of Drogheda. "It will clearly appear," he said, "where the guilt will lie if innocent persons should come to suffer with the nocent." His terms were quarter and prison to the officers, quarter and freedom to the soldiers, protection from plunder to the town. These terms were refused, and both sides continued the fight. Suddenly, some breaches being made in the castle, the captain surrendered it, and by a surprise the whole army of the Commonwealth poured into the town. The townsmen took part in the defence, and townsmen and garrison together were forced into the marketplace. There, as at Drogheda, a promiscuous massacre ensued. Upward of 2,000 were slain, and with them not a few of the citizens, and the town was delivered over to pillage. It is asserted by the Catholic writers that a body of women who had taken refuge round the cross were deliberately slaughtered, and that a general massacre took place without regard to sex or age. Priests were killed at once, and in the sack and pillage undoubtedly some non-combatants, it may be some women and children. But these things were incidents of such a storm, and were not done by design or order of the general. This is his own story. Quote, "While I was preparing of it, studying to preserve the town from plunder, that it might be of the more use to you and your army, the captain, who was one of the commissioners, being fairly treated, yielded up the castle to us. Upon the top of which our men no sooner appeared, but the enemy quitted the walls of the town, which our men perceiving, ran violently upon the town with their ladders, and stormed it. And when they were come into the market-place, the enemy making a stiff resistance, our forces brake them, and then put all to the sword that came in their way. 2 boatfuls of the enemy attempting to escape, being overpressed with numbers, sank, whereby were drowned near 300 of them. I believe in all there was lost of the enemy not many less than 2,000, and I believe not 20 of yours from first to last of the siege. And indeed it hath, not without cause, been deeply set upon our hearts, that we, intending better to this place than so great a ruin, hoping the town might be of more use to you and your army, yet God would not have it so, but by an unexpected providence in his righteous justice brought a just judgment upon them, causing them to become a prey to the soldier, who in their piracies had made praise of so many families, and now with their bloods to answer the cruelties which they have exercised upon the lives of divers poor Protestants. This town is now so in your power, that of the former inhabitants, I believe scarce 1 in 20 can challenge any property in their houses. Most of them are run away, and many of them killed in this service. And it were to be wished that an honest people would come and plant here." End of quote. The blow that had desolated Drogheda and Wexford did not need to be repeated. Ross was taken. The Munster garrisons, Cork, Kinsale, and others, joined the Commonwealth. And within 3 months of Cromwell's march from Dublin, the whole of the towns on the eastern and southern sides of Ireland, except Waterford and some others, were reduced to the Parliament. Waterford resisted them. A wet winter set in, and with the wet, dysentery and fever. Cromwell fell ill, many officers sickened. General Jones died. "What England lost hereby is above me to speak," wrote the general. "I am sure I lost a noble friend and companion in labours. You see how God mingles out the cup to us. Indeed, we are at this time a crazy company, yet we live in his sight, and shall work the time that is appointed us, and shall rest after that in peace." After a short rest, on January 29th, Cromwell was again in the field. he passed into the heart of the island, into Kilkenny and Tipperary, Clogheen, Castletown, Fethard, Callan, Cashel, Cahir, Kilkenny, Carrick were taken after a short defence, and Clonmel at last surrendered after a desperate attempt at storm, which cost Cromwell, it is said, 2,000 men. This was his last great fight in Ireland. He had now crushed opposition in the whole east and south of the island. The north had returned to the Protestant cause. Waterford fell soon after, and except Limerick, Galway, and a few fortresses, the Parliament's forces were masters of the island. Cromwell had been 9 months in Ireland, and at no time possessed an army of more than 15,000 men. Within that time he had taken a score of strong places, and in a series of bloody encounters had dispersed or annihilated armies of far greater number than his own. An official summons to England had been sent in January, and it was not till the end of May that he actually obeyed it. As Cromwell's practice in warfare in Ireland differed somewhat from what he observed elsewhere, and as from that day to this it has been the subject of furious invective, a few words thereon are plainly needed. Cromwell had gone to Ireland, at imminent risk to his cause, to recover it to the Parliament in the shortest possible time and with a relatively small army. He had gone there first to punish, as was believed, a wholesale massacre and a social revolution, to restore the Irish soil to England, and to replace the Protestant ascendancy. In the view of the Commonwealth government, the Mass was by law a crime, Catholic priests were legally outlaws, and all who resisted the Parliament were constructively guilty of murder and rebellion. Such were the accepted axioms of the whole Puritan party, and of Cromwell as much as any man. In such a war he held that where a place was stormed after summons, all in arms might justly be put to the sword, though no longer capable of resistance, and though they amounted to thousands. They, he writes, refusing conditions seasonably offered, were all put to the sword. Repeatedly he shot all officers who surrendered at discretion. Officers who had once served the Parliament he hanged. Priests taken alive were hanged. As for your clergymen, as you call them, wrote Oliver to the governor of Kilkenny, in case you agree for a surrender, they shall march away safely. But if they fall otherwise into my hands, I believe they know what to expect from me. At Gowran the castle surrendered. Quote, the next day the colonel, the major, and the rest of the commission officers were shot to death. In the same castle also he took a popish priest, who was chaplain to the Catholics in this regiment, who was caused to be hanged. End of quote. The Bishop of Ross, marching to save Clonmel with 5,000 men, was defeated by Broghill, captured, and hanged in sight of his own men. The Bishop of Clogher was routed by Coote and Venables and shared the same fate. All their friars were knocked on the head promiscuously, Cromwell wrote at Drogheda, as the Catholic martyrologies assert, with torture. Peaceable inhabitants were not to be molested, but all who had taken part in or supported the rebellion of 1641 were liable to justice. For soldiers he found a new career. By a stroke of profound policy he encouraged foreign embassies to enlist Irish volunteers, giving them a free pass abroad. And thus it is said some 40,000 Irishmen ultimately passed into the service of foreign sovereigns. With great energy and skill, the Lord Lieutenant set about the reorganization of government in Ireland. A leading feature of this was the Cromwellian settlement afterward carried out under the Protectorate, by which immense tracts of land in the provinces of Ulster, Leinster, and Munster were allotted to English settlers and the landowners of Irish birth removed into Connaught. Cromwell has left on record his own principles of action in the famous declaration which he issued in January in reply to the Irish bishops. Ireland, he says, quote, was once united to England. Englishmen had inheritances and leases which they had purchased, and they lived peaceably. You broke this union. You, unprovoked, put the English to the most unheard of and most barbarous massacre, without respect of sex or age, that ever the sun beheld. It is a fig leaf of pretense that they fight for their king. Really, it is for men guilty of blood. Helium prelaticum et religiosum, as you say. You are a part of Antichrist, whose kingdom the Scripture so expressly speaks should be laid in blood, yea, in the blood of the saints. You quote my own words at Ross, he says, that where the Parliament of England have power, the exercise of the Mass will not be allowed of, and you say that this is a design to extirpate the Catholic religion. I cannot extirpate what has never been rooted. These are my intentions. I shall not, where I have power, suffer the exercise of the Mass. Nor shall I suffer any papists where I find them seducing the people, or by overt act violating the laws. As for the people, what thoughts they have in matters of religion in their own breasts I cannot reach. But as to the charge of massacre, destruction, or banishment, he says, Give us an instance of one man since my coming into Ireland, not in arms, massacred, destroyed, or banished, concerning the massacre or the destruction of whom justice hath not been done or endeavored to be done. This very pointed and daring challenge could hardly have been publicly made by such a man as Cromwell, if to his knowledge a slaughter of women and unarmed men had occurred. On the other hand, it is certain that priests and others had been killed in cold blood, and a general who delivers over a city to pillage and forbids quarter can hardly say where outrage and massacre will cease. As to banishment, the Cromwellian settlement was necessarily based on the banishment of those whom the settlers displaced. With regard to the policy of confiscation and resettlement, Cromwell warmly justifies it. It is the just way of meeting rebellion, he says. You have forfeited your estates, and it is just to raise money by escheating your lands. But apart from the land forfeited, which is but a part of the account, if ever men were engaged in a just and righteous cause, it was this, he asserts. Quote, We are come to ask an account of the innocent blood that hath been shed, and to endeavour to bring to an account, by the presence and blessing of the Almighty, in whom alone is our hope and strength, all who, by appearing in arms, seek to justify the same. We come to break the power of lawless rebels, who, having cast off the authority of England, live as enemies to human society, whose principles, the world hath experience, are to destroy and subjugate all men not complying with them. We come, by the assistance of God, to hold forth and maintain the lustre and glory of English liberty in a nation where we have an undoubted right to do it, wherein the people of Ireland, if they listen not to such seducers as you are, may equally participate in all benefits, to use liberty and fortune equally with Englishmen if they keep out of arms. End of quote. Such was the basis of the famous Cromwellian settlement, by far the most thorough act in the long history of the conquest of Ireland, by far the most wholesale effort to impose on Ireland the Protestant faith and English ascendancy. Wholesale and thorough, but not enough for its purpose. It failed like all the others, did more perhaps than any other to bind Ireland to the Catholic Church and to alienate Irishmen from the English rule. On the Irish race it has left undying memories and a legend of tyranny which is summed up in the peasant saying of the curse of Cromwell. Cromwell, not worse than the Puritans and English of his age, but nobler and more just, must yet for generations to come bear the weight of the legendary curse. He was the incarnation of Puritan passion, the instrument of English ambition, the official authority by whom the whole work was carried out, the one man ultimately responsible for the rest. and it is thus that on him lies chiefly the weight of this secular national quarrel. End of section 34. Read by Jeffrey Wilson, Ames, Iowa, in February of 2023.
Section 35 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 11, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Molière creates modern comedy, A.D. 1659, by Henri van Laun. The 17th century was a period of a very remarkable literary outburst in France, an outburst which has done much to mold French genius of more recent times. The latter part of the century, which has been called the Augustan Age of France, the age of Louis XIV, has certainly been but seldom equaled in the number and variety of the writers who adorned it. Yet it owes much of its brilliancy, much of its rapid development, to the training of the decades previous to 1650, and especially to the enthusiastic patronage of that great statesman Richelieu. Were a Frenchman seeking for a single event, a single date to mark the most striking moment of this literary era, he would probably select the foundation of the French Academy by Richelieu in 1635. Or perhaps he might turn to the production of Corneille's most famous tragedy, Le Cid, in 1633. Neither of these events, however, has quite what we would recognize as a worldwide significance. The Academy has done much for France, but it has always remained a French Academy, and the 40 quote-unquote immortal Frenchmen who constitute its membership have not always owed their election solely to literary eminence. Neither have Corneille's tragedies been accepted as models by the world at large. But under Corneille's influence, the French stage developed from a state of buffoonery and wooden imitation of the ancients to a state where a greater artist than Corneille gave it really worldwide prominence. Molière is not only the most celebrated of French actor-managers, he is the greatest of all character comedy writers, the teacher of all future generations, and the satiric scourge of his own. When in 1659 his comedy Les Précieuses Ridicules took Paris by storm, it did more than make a reformation of the manners of its own. It taught the world what true comedy should be, and it sent ringing through the universe forever a mighty trumpet note against hypocrisy and folly. The drama attained its highest excellence and repute in the age of Louis XIV, and we should not be making a very hazardous assertion if we were to say that the literature of that epoch in France attained its height of glory in the drama. No French dramatist has excelled Molière, Corneille, and Racine. No group of authors in the 17th century were more brilliant, more powerful, more originative. When we turn our eyes upon the stage for which these three wrote, we find ourselves in the full splendor of the Augustan age, in all its refinement and culture, its luxury and elegance, its strength of wit and justness of expression, its social polish and gorgeous display. Great as was the advance made by the audience of TedL upon the audience of the moralities and sottises, the advance of the court and society under the Valois was equally great. The Grand Monarque, listening to a masterpiece of Corneille, Molière, or Racine, surrounded by his brilliant circle of lords and ladies, represented an almost incalculable development of ceremonious culture, in idea, in apparel, and in general surroundings, since the day when, about 100 years before, while the blossom of the Renaissance was barely expanded, the popinjay King Henry II looked on at the first crude sketch of a French classical play. Stage, scenery, appointments, audience, critic, music, actors, and authors all now bore witness to and adorned, as they were in fact the most elaborate product of, an Augustan age. Paris up to this time had had little opportunity of knowing what true comedy was. It had had farces in abundance, not only of home growth, but imported, and from Italy in particular. When Molière came before the public with his homogeneous and well-trained company, and his repertory of excellent character sketches and comic situations, the prevailing sentiment was expressed by a member of the audience which listened to the first production of his Précieuses Ridicules. Courage, Molière, this is genuine comedy. France had long been waiting for genuine comedy, waiting rather by an instinctive requirement of the national genius, and with an aptitude to appreciate the highest comic art as soon as it might be manifested, than with any definite conception of the exact thing that was lacking on the stage. The French nature was precisely fitted to produce and to enjoy the loftiest style of character comedy, but no modern literature had hitherto exhibited that which Molière was to provide. The author of the Précieuses Ridicules and Tartuffe was essentially the outcome of his age, the dramatist of drawing-room life, whose genius enabled him to web the foibles of the salon with elegant phraseology, the scenic effect with admirable poetic expression, and the contrast between his lofty and conscientious work and the puerilities and license of the Spanish and Italian models was as marked as it was readily recognized. Yet it was no easy matter to acclimatize in France even the high style of comedy introduced by Molière, and he had to intermix it with a good many farces to make it go down. For 12 long years, leading the life of a strolling player, Molière observed and studied character, and when at last he thought himself safe from opposition, under the powerful patronage of Louis XIV, the Church, the University, the Sorbonne, and the bigotry of the statesmen, once more united, as in the age of Francis I, conspired to cast stumbling blocks in the way of literary freedom. It was the authorities of the Church which, shocked and jealous at the enthusiasm which greeted the appearance of Tartuffe, brought the veto of the king to bear against the company of the Palais Royal. And though Molière believed that his private intercession had obtained the removal of this veto, his enemies were bold and powerful enough during the absence of Louis on the further representation of the play to prevent its production a second time. Molière was able to cope with his adversaries, yet it is a noteworthy fact that the decree of excommunication passed against comedians in France was not absolutely rescinded until the present century. We do not forget that Corneille wrote comedies before Molière, and indeed there is no doubt that the younger of the two dramatists owed something, even in comedy, to the older. Molière began by adapting from and imitating the Italian and Spanish comedy writers, upon whom many of his first farces were founded, and it is not at all unlikely that he even remodeled some of the earlier sotties. It was perhaps due to Corneille's influence as much as to anything else that his genius at last discovered its true level. He confessed to Boileau his great indebtedness to Le Menteur. When it was first performed, he says, I had already a wish to write, but was in doubt as to what it should be. My ideas were still confused, but this piece determined them. In short, but for the appearance of Le Menteur, though I should no doubt have written comedies of intrigue, like L'Étourdi or Le Dépit Amoureux, I should perhaps never have written the Misanthrope." Eliminate the generosity from this confession, and no doubt the truth remains that Molière did form his best style of comedy upon the master of French tragedy. Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, who subsequently assumed the name of Molière, was born in the year that François de Sales died, 1 year after the birth of La Fontaine, 4 years before the birth of his friend Chapelle and of Madame de Sévigné. When Le Cid was first performed, he was 14 years old, and 22 at the time of the first representation of Le Menteur. The son of a valet de chambre tapissier of Louis XIII, he succeeded in due course to the emoluments and honors, such as they were, of his father. But he had early conceived a passion for the stage, and in 1643 he attached himself to the Illustre Théâtre of Madeleine Béjart, a woman 4 years his senior. With her were already associated her brother Joseph, her sister Geneviève, about 2 years younger than Molière, and 8 others, most of whom had dropped out of the company before its final settlement in Paris. For a year or two the Illustre Théâtre tempted fortune in the capital without success, and in 1646 they commenced a tour through the provinces, which was destined to continue for 12 years. The debts which they had incurred weighed upon them during the whole of this time, and principally upon Molière, who was once imprisoned and several times arrested at the suit of the company's creditors. No doubt these latter had discovered that the young actor had friends who would rescue him from durance, which was done on several occasions. But as late as 1660, we read of Molière's discharging probably the last of the debts for which at this period he made himself responsible. The first plays acted by Molière and his friends were, of course, the farces then most in vogue, among others the comedies of Scarron and the yet inferior productions of Denis Bey and Desfontaines. The former had written a ridiculous piece called L'Hôpital des Fous. The latter was the author of Eurymédon ou L'Illustre Pirate, L'Illustre Comédien ou Le Martyr de Saint-Gène, and of several other inflated pieces. It would be difficult to fix the exact date at which Molière's earliest plays were produced, but it is probable that he began to write for his company as soon as he had enlisted in it. He seems, like Shakespeare, to have, in part at least, adapted the plays of others. But in 1653, if not earlier, he had produced L'Étourdi, and in 1656, Le Dépit Amoureux. The Illustre Théâtre is heard of at Nantes, Limoges, Bordeaux, Toulouse, Narbonne, and Lyon, where Molière produced his first serious attempt at high comedy in verse, L'Étourdi. In 1653 they played by invitation at the country seat of the Prince de Condé, the schoolfellow of Molière. 3 years later they played the Dépit Amoureux at Béziers, during the meeting in that town of the Parliament of Languedoc. At Grenoble in 1658, the painter Mignard, with other of his admirers, persuaded him to take his company, for he was joint manager with Madeleine Béjart, to Paris, and this he did after a concluding trip to Rouen. In Paris they began by playing before Philippe, Duke of Anjou, the brother of Louis XIV, who took them under his protection and introduced them to the court. At this time the company was considerably stronger as well as richer than when it left Paris. There were now 4 ladies, Madeleine Béjart, Geneviève Béjart, Duparc, and Debris, the 2 brothers Béjart, The younger, Louis, had joined at Lyon, Duparc, Brize, Dufresne, and Croizac, making, with Molière himself, 11 persons. It may be concluded that their tour, or at all events, that part of it which dated from Lyon, had been very successful. For we find that Joseph Béjart, who died early in 1659, left behind him a fortune of 24,000 golden crowns. So at least we are told by the physician Guy Patin in a letter dated May 27, 1659, and he adds, "Is it not enough to make one believe that Peru is no longer in America but in Paris?" The condition of the drama in Paris at the time when Molière returned to the capital was anything but satisfactory. There were in 1658 5 theatres in Paris, one at the Hôtel de Bourgogne, one at the Marais, one under the patronage of Mademoiselle, daughter of Gaston, Duke of Orléans, a Spanish company, and an Italian company at the Petit Bourbon, under the managership of Torelli. It was with the first and last of these that Molière came chiefly into conflict, and it is probable that the other 3 were of no great account, at all events as competitors for the favor of the general public. Torelli soon found that the newcomer commanded his hundreds where he himself could only count by scores, and he gave up the Petit Bourbon to Molière in 1659. Molière's company called themselves Comédiens de Monsieur, and after Torelli had left them full possession of the Petit Bourbon, their greatest rivals in public favor were the company at the Hôtel de Bourgogne, who played Corneille, Scudéry, Scarron, and other authors of less note. In 1659, Molière took the town by storm with his Précieuses Ridicules, a satire in one act on the exaggerations of the Hôtel de Rambouillet. This was followed in the succeeding year by Sganarelle ou Le Cocu Imaginaire. In the beginning of 1661 appeared Don Garci de Navarre, a heroic piece in 5 acts, intended to delineate the evils of passionate jealousy. And in the same year were produced L'École des Maris, a satire on unreasonable jealousy, and Les Fâcheux, a court sketch of several kinds of bores. In 1662, L'École des Femmes, an attempt to show the danger of bringing girls up in too strict a manner, with its sequel, the Critique de l'École des Femmes, in the year after. Boursault, an amiable man, but a mediocre playwright, envious of Molière's growing fame, wrote for the Hôtel de Bourgogne, which eagerly accepted, if did not bespeak, his piece Le Portrait du Peintre ou la Contre-Critique de l'École des Femmes, in which he attempted to bring his brother author into ridicule. But Molière took ample revenge in his Impromptu de Versailles, in which he soundly lashed his rivals, though it may be mentioned to his honor that it was never printed during his lifetime. In 1664 he wrote the Mariage Forcé, a one-act piece with 8 entrées de ballet, specially designed for court representation, in which the king himself was pleased to dance, and a month or 2 later, the Princesse des Lides, a cumbrous and comparatively inferior production, done in great haste at the command of Louis XIV, who had determined upon an 8 days festival in honor of Louise de la Vallière. It was during these festivities that for the first time was represented the first 3 acts of Molière's masterpiece, Tartuffe ou L'Imposteur, a play well worthy of the best and most legitimate subject which satire can have to deal with. Nothing can be fairer or more appropriate than that the art which consists in feigning a representation of real life on the stage should take as the butt of its ridicule and the object of its skill the man whose whole life and character are engaged in feigning the possession of virtue and seeming to be that which he is not. The earliest satirists and dramatists have seized on the topic with avidity, and to go no further out of our way than Molière's predecessors in France, we may mention the authors of the romance of Reynard the Fox, Rudebeuf, Jean de Main, the author of the Farce des Brus, Régnier, Scarron, even Pascal. Very various, no doubt, are the hypocritical types encountered in the works of these and other satirists, but all must necessarily have a certain amount of family likeness, and many hereditary trait is recognized as common to at least two, if not to all, of the race. Quote, Molière gives us the hypocrite by nature, the man who would be a canting scoundrel even if it did not, quote-unquote, pay, who cannot help being so, who is a human being and therefore not perfect, who is a man and thus sensually inclined, who employs certain means to subdue his passions and to become a quote-unquote whited sepulchre, but who gives way all the more to them when he imagines that he can do so with impunity. Tartuffe, who ought to be bound to Orgon by the strongest ties of gratitude, allows the son to be turned out of the house by his father, because the latter will not believe the accusations brought against the hypocrite, tries to seduce his benefactor's wife, to marry his daughter by a first marriage, and finally, after having obtained all his dupe's property, betrays him to the king as a criminal against the state. The denouement of the play is that Tartuffe himself is led to prison, and that vice is for the nonce punished on the stage as it deserves to be. Tartuffe made many enemies for Molière, especially among the clergy, who were not afraid of being twitted with their too ready application to themselves of the moral of the play. It was prohibited in 1664, and some zealous clergymen even went so far as to write treatises which they hoped would counteract the effects of the dramatist's works. For their own sakes we may hope that they did not succeed. The king was not strong enough to withstand the influence of the clergy, and did not venture at once to remove the interdict. The relaxation did not take place until 5 years later, but it was at this time that Louis XIV bestowed on Molière's company the name of Comédien du Roi, and the troupe was subsidied by a yearly pension of 7,000 livres. Don Juan ou Le Festin de Pierre, a piece in which a nobleman, who is a libertine as well as a skeptic and a hypocrite, is brought upon the stage, was first acted in February 1665, and raised such an outcry that it was also forbidden to be played. In spite of failing health and serious depression of spirits, Molière continued to produce play after play, and some of his best and most admired were the fruits of his most unhappy moments. Early in 1662 he had married Armande Béjart, the youngest sister of Madeleine Béjart, who was about 20 years younger than her husband. It was apparently a marriage of mutual affection, but it can hardly be said to have been a fortunate one for either. Armande loved admiration from whatever source, and indulged in pleasures which her husband could not share. The breach between them gradually widened, and it was not until 1671 that their friends brought about a better understanding between them. Meanwhile, in September 1665, appeared L'Amour Médecin, a comedy in 3 acts, in which a lover appears disguised as a physician to cure the object of his love, pretends to be dumb, and in which Molière makes his first serious attack against the doctors. It was acted only a few times when the theatre had to be closed on account of the author's illness, and the death of Anne of Austria in the spring of 1666 delayed its opening until June of that year. It was then that the Misanthrope was introduced to the public, a play which has been ranked as high in comedy as Athalie is ranked in French tragedy. The circumstances under which it was written were such as might almost warrant us in calling it a tragedy, for the great satirist, who had spent his life in copying the eccentricities of others, had now employed the season of his illness to commit to paper a drama in which he was himself the principal actor. The misanthrope Alceste loves the coquette Célimène, almost against his will, and we can imagine the feelings with which Molière himself took the role of Alceste to his wife's Célimène. In 1669, the king, growing more independent of his advisers, sanctioned the production of Tartuffe, but this strengthening of his repertory did not prevent Molière producing Monsieur de Pourcendac, a farcical comedy in 3 acts, in which there is a masterly and not exaggerated sketch of a consultation of doctors in Molière's time. And in 1670, the Bourgeois Gentilhomme, in which the folly of aping noblemen is delineated, as well as the Amant Magnifique, a comedy ballet for the particular behoof of the court. In 1671 he combined with Corneille and Quinault in the production of Psyche, a tragedy ballet, and wrote, or rather perhaps remodeled from among his earlier efforts, the Fourberie de Scapin and the Comtesse d'Escarbagnas. His 2 last works were among the highest and happiest creations of his genius, the Femme Savante, a sort of sequel to the Précieuse Ridicule, though of a more general application, and the Malade Imaginaire. In the latter, he insisted on playing the part of Argan upon the first presentation, February 10, 1673, but it was the crowning act of his energetic mind. He became ill during the 4th representation of the play and died that same evening, February 17th, exactly 1 year after Madeleine Béjart, with whom, 27 years ago, he had set out from Paris with little more ambition than that of earning a livelihood by the pursuit of a congenial career. Molière placed upon the stage nearly all human passions which lend themselves to comedy or farce: sordid avarice, lavish prodigality, shameless vice, womanly resignation, artless coquetry, greed for money, downright hypocrisy, would-be gentility, self-sufficient vanity, fashionable swindling, misanthropy, heartlessness, plain common sense, knowledge of the world, coarse jealousy, irresolution, impudence, pride of birth, egotism, self-conceit, pusillanimity, ingenuity, roguery, affectations, homelessness, thoughtlessness, pedantry, arrogance, and many more faults and vices find their representatives. The language which they employ is always natural to them, and is neither too gross nor over-refined. His verse has none of the stiffness of the ordinary French rhyme, and becomes in his hands, as well as his prose, a delightful medium for sparkling sallies, bitter sarcasms, and well-sustained and sprightly conversations. And how remarkable and delicate is the nuance between his different characters, though they may represent the same profession or an identical personage. None of his doctors are alike. His male and female scholars are all dissimilar. Mascarille is not Gros René, Scapin is not Sbrigani, Don Juan is not Dorante, Alceste is not Philinte, Isabelle is not Agnès, Sganarelle is not always the same, Ariste is not Beralde nor Chrysalde, while even his servants, Nicole, Dorine, Martine, Marotte, Toinette, Claudine, and Lisette, his boobies, such as Alain and Lubin, and his intrigants in petticoats, such as Nerine, Lucette, Frosine, vary in character, expression, and conduct. They exemplify the saying, like master, like man. A remarkable characteristic of Molière is that he does not exaggerate. His fools are never over-witty, his buffoons too grotesque, his men of wit too anxious to display their smartness, nor his fine gentlemen too fond of immodest and ribald talk. His satire is always kept within bounds, his repartees are never out of place, his plots are but seldom intricate, and the moral of his plays is not obtruded, but follows as a natural consequence of the whole. He rarely rises to those lofty realms of poetry where Shakespeare so often soars, for he wrote not idealistic but character comedies, which is perhaps the reason that some of his would-be admirers consider him rather commonplace. His claim to distinction is based only on strong common sense, good manners, sound morality, real wit, true humor, a great, facile, and accurate command of language, and a photographic delineation of nature. It cannot be denied that there is little action in his plays, but there is a great deal of natural conversation. His personages show that he was a most attentive observer of men, even at court, where a certain varnish of over-refinement conceals nearly all individual features. He generally makes vice appear in its most ridiculous aspect, in order to let his audience laugh and despise it. His aim is to correct the follies of the age by exposing them to ridicule. End of section 35.
Section 36 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 11, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Cromwell's Rule in England, The Restoration A.D. 1660, by Thomas Carlyle. Editor's Introduction. Brief as was the duration of the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, it was one of the most extraordinary periods in English history. It is now commonly admitted that Cromwell was England's greatest ruler. After his first appearance in Charles's Third Parliament, 1628, at the age of 29, Cromwell returned to the obscurity of his Huntingdon home. Not until he entered the Long Parliament, 1640, did he really begin his marvelous career. However variously judged by his contemporaries and by later generations, Cromwell's part in the world's affairs was of unquestioned magnitude. The very greatness of his career, the power and extent of his influence, and the combination of various elements in his career have made adequate judgment of him difficult and general agreement concerning him well nigh impossible. But that he was, at all events, the most typical Englishman of his time is now generally acknowledged. In the three views here presented, Cromwell's character and career and the Restoration are set forth from quite different points of view. Carlyle shows us in Cromwell one of his most admired heroes. Green gives us the modern historian's dispassionate conclusions, while the contemporary narrative of the old diarist Pepys preserves the personal observations of a participator in the scenes which he describes. Charles II had spent years in exile on the continent. He was finally proclaimed King of England at Westminster, May 8, 1660. Pepys describes his convoy from Holland to Dover and his reception by the people who had invited him to return to his country and his throne. End of introduction. Thomas Carlyle. We have had many civil wars in England. Wars of red and white roses, wars of Simon de Montfort, wars enough which are not very memorable. But that war of the Puritans has a significance which belongs to no one of the others. Trusting to your candor, which will suggest on the other side what I have not room to say, I will call it a section once more of that great universal war which alone makes up the true history of the world, the war of belief against unbelief. The struggle of men intent on the real essence of things against men intent on the semblances and forms of things. The Puritans, to many, seem mere savage iconoclasts, fierce destroyers of forms. But it were more just to call them haters of untrue forms. I hope we know how to respect Laud and his king as well as them. Poor Laud seems to me to have been weak and ill-starred, not dishonest, an unfortunate pedant rather than anything worse. His dreams and superstitions, at which they laugh so, have an affectionate, lovable kind of character. He is like a college tutor, whose whole world is forms, college rules, whose notion is that these are the life and safety of the world. He is placed suddenly, with that unalterable, luckless notion of his, at the head not of a college but of a nation, to regulate the most complex, deep-reaching interests of men. He thinks they ought to go by the old decent regulations, nay, that their salvation will lie in extending and improving these. Like a weak man, he drives with spasmodic vehemence toward his purpose, cramps himself to it, heeding no voice of prudence, no cry of pity. He will have his college rules obeyed by his collegians, that first, and till that nothing. He is an ill-starred pedant, as I said. He would have it the world was a college of that kind, and the world was not that. Alas, was not his doom stern enough? Whatever wrongs he did, were they not all frightfully avenged on him? It is meritorious to insist on forms. Religion and all else naturally clothes itself in forms. Everywhere the formed world is the only habitable one. The naked formlessness of Puritanism is not the thing I praise in the Puritans, it is the thing I pity, praising only the spirit which had rendered that inevitable. All substances clothe themselves in forms, but there are suitable, true forms, and then there are untrue, unsuitable. As the briefest definition, one might say, forms which grow round a substance, if we rightly understand that, will correspond to the real nature and purport of it, will be true, good. Forms which are consciously put round a substance, bad. I invite you to reflect on this. It distinguishes true from false in ceremonial form, earnest solemnity from empty pageant in all human things. There must be a veracity, a natural spontaneity in forms. In the commonest meeting of men, a person making what we call set speeches, is not he an offence? In the mere drawing-room, whatsoever courtesies you see to be grimaces, prompted by no spontaneous reality within, are a thing you wish to get away from. But suppose now it were some matter of vital concernment, some transcendent matter, as divine worship is, about which your whole soul, struck dumb with its excess of feeling, knew not how to form itself into utterance at all, and preferred formless silence to any utterance there possible. What should we say of a man coming forward to represent or utter it for you in the way of upholsterer mummery? Such a man, let him depart swiftly if he love himself. You have lost your only son, are mute, struck down, without even tears. An importunate man importunately offers to celebrate funeral games for him in the manner of the Greeks. Such mummery is not only not to be accepted, it is hateful, unendurable. It is what the old prophets called idolatry, worshipping of hollow shows, what all earnest men do and will reject. we can partly understand what these poor Puritans meant. Laud dedicating that St. Catherine Creed's church, in the manner we have it described, with his multiple ceremonial bowings, gesticulations, exclamations, surely it is rather the rigorous formal pedant intent on his college rules than the earnest prophet intent on the essence of the matter. Puritanism found such forms insupportable, trampled on such forms. We have to excuse it for saying, no form at all rather than such. It stood preaching in its bare pulpit, with nothing but the Bible in its hand. Nay, a man preaching from his earnest soul into the earnest souls of men, is not this virtually the essence of all churches whatsoever? The nakedest, savagest reality, I say, is preferable to any semblance, however dignified. Besides, it will clothe itself with due semblance by and by if it be real. No fear of that, actually no fear at all. Given the living man, there will be found clothes for him. He will find himself clothes. But the suit of clothes pretending that it is both clothes and man? We cannot fight the French by 300,000 red uniforms. There must be men in the inside of them. Semblance, I assert, must actually not divorce itself from reality. If semblance do, why, then there must be men found to rebel against semblance, for it has become a lie. These two antagonisms at war here, in the case of Laud and the Puritans, are as old nearly as the world. They went to fierce battle over England in that age, and fought out their confused controversy to a certain length, with many results for all of us. In the age which directly followed that of the Puritans, their cause or themselves were little likely to have justice done them. Charles II and his Rochesters were not the kind of men you would set to judge what the worth or meaning of such men might have been. That there could be any faith or truth in the life of a man was what these poor Rochesters, and the age they ushered in, had forgotten. Puritanism was hung on gibbets, like the bones of the leading Puritans. Its work nevertheless went on accomplishing itself. All true work of a man, hang the author of it on what gibbet you like, must and will accomplish itself. We have our habeas corpus, our free representation of the people. Acknowledgment, wide as the world, that all men are, or else must, shall, and will become, what we call free men, men with their life grounded on reality and justice, not on tradition, which has become unjust and a chimera. This in part, and much besides this, was the work of the Puritans. And indeed, as these things became gradually manifest, the character of the Puritans began to clear itself. Their memories were, one after another, taken down from the gibbet. Nay, a certain portion of them are now, in these days, as good as canonized. Eliot, Hampden, Pym, nay, Ludlow, Hutchinson, Vane himself, are admitted to be a kind of heroes, political conscript fathers, to whom in no small degree we owe what makes us a free England. It would not be safe for anybody to designate these men as wicked now. Few Puritans of note but find their apologists somewhere, and have a certain reverence paid them by earnest men. One Puritan, I think, and almost he alone, our poor Cromwell, seems to hang yet on the gibbet, and find no hearty apologist anywhere. Him neither saint nor sinner will acquit of great wickedness. A man of ability, infinite talent, courage, and so forth, but he betrayed the cause. Selfish ambition, dishonesty, duplicity, a fierce, coarse, hypocritical Tartuffe, turning all that noble struggle for constitutional liberty into a sorry farce played for his own benefit. This and worse is the character they give of Cromwell. And then there come contrasts with Washington and others. Above all, with these noble Pyms and Hampdens, whose noble work he stole for himself, and ruined into a futility and deformity. From of old, I will confess, this theory of Cromwell's falsity has been incredible to me. Nay, I cannot believe the like of any great man whatever. Multitudes of great men figure in history as false, selfish men, but if we will consider it, they are but figures for us, unintelligible shadows. We do not see into them as men that could have existed at all. A superficial, unbelieving generation only, with no eye but for the surfaces and semblances of things, could form such notions of great men. Can a great soul be possible without a conscience in it, the essence of all real souls, great or small? No, we cannot figure Cromwell as a falsity and fatuity. The longer I study him and his career, I believe this the less. Why should we? There is no evidence of it. Is it not strange that, after all the mountains of calumny this man has been subject to, after being represented as the very prince of liars, who never, or hardly ever, spoke truth, but always some cunning counterfeit of truth, there should not yet have been one falsehood brought clearly home to him? A prince of liars, and no lie spoken by him. Not one that I could yet get sight of. It is like Pocock asking Grotius, "Where is your proof of Mahomet's pigeon?" No proof. Let us leave all these calumnious chimeras as chimeras ought to be left. They are not portraits of the man, they are distracted phantasms of him, the joint product of hatred and darkness. Looking at the man's life with our own eyes, it seems to me a very different hypothesis suggests itself. What little we know of his earlier obscure years, distorted as it has come down to us, does it not all betoken an earnest, affectionate, sincere kind of man? His nervous, melancholic temperament indicates rather a seriousness too deep for him. Of those stories of spectres, of the white spectre in broad daylight predicting that he should be King of England, we are not bound to believe much. Probably no more than of the other black spectre or devil in person, to whom the officer saw him sell himself before Worcester fight. But the mournful, oversensitive, hypochondriac humor of Oliver in his young years is otherwise indisputably known. The Huntingdon physician told Sir Philip Warwick himself he had often been sent for at midnight. Mr. Cromwell was full of hypochondria, thought himself near dying, and had fancies about the town cross. These things are significant. Such an excitable, deep-feeling nature, in that rugged, stubborn strength of his, is not the symptom of falsehood, it is the symptom and promise of quite other than falsehood. The young Oliver is sent to study law, falls, or is said to have fallen, for a little period, into some of the dissipations of youth, but if so, speedily repents, abandons all this. Not much above 20, he is married, settled as an altogether grave and quiet man. He pays back what money he had won at gambling, says the story. He does not think any gain of that kind could be really his. It is very interesting, very natural, this conversion, as they well name it, this awakening of a great true soul from the worldly slough, to see into the awful truth of things, to see that time and its shows all rested on eternity, and this poor earth of ours was the threshold either of heaven or of hell. Oliver's life at St. Ives and Ely, as a sober, industrious farmer, is it not altogether as that of a true and devout man? He has renounced the world and its ways. Its prizes are not the thing that can enrich him. He tills the earth, he reads his Bible, daily assembles his servants round him to worship God. He comforts persecuted ministers, is fond of preachers, nay, can himself preach, exhorts his neighbors to be wise to redeem the time. In all this, what hypocrisy, ambition, cant, or other falsity? The man's hopes, I do believe, were fixed on the other higher world, his aim to get well thither by walking well through his humble course in this world. He courts no notice. What could notice here do for him? Ever in his great taskmaster's eye. It is striking, too, how he comes out into public view. He, since no other is willing to come, in resistance to a public grievance. I mean, in that matter of the Bedford Fens. No one else will go to law with authority, therefore he will. That matter once settled, he returns back into obscurity to his Bible and his plough. Gain influence? His influence is the most legitimate, derived from personal knowledge of him as a just, religious, reasonable, and determined man. In this way he has lived till past 40. Old age is now in view of him, and the earnest portal of death and eternity. It was at this point that he suddenly became ambitious. I do not interpret his parliamentary mission in that way. His successes in Parliament, his successes through the war, are honest successes of a brave man, who has more resolution in the heart of him, more light in the head of him, than other men. His prayers to God, his spoken thanks to the God of victory, who had preserved him safe and carried him forward so far, through the furious clash of a world all set in conflict, through desperate-looking envelopments at Dunbar, through the death-hail of so many battles, mercy after mercy, to the crowning mercy of Worcester fight. All this is good and genuine for a deep-hearted Calvinistic Cromwell. Only to vain unbelieving cavaliers, worshipping not God but their own love-locks, frivolities, and formalities, living quite apart from contemplations of God, living without God in the world, need it seem hypocritical. Nor will his participation in the king's death involve him in condemnation with us. It is a stern business, killing of a king. But if you once go to war with him, it lies there. This and all else lie there. Once at war, you have made wager of battle with him. It is he to die, or else you. Reconciliation is problematic, may be possible, or far more likely, is impossible. It is now pretty generally admitted that the Parliament, having vanquished Charles I, had no way of making any tenable arrangement with him. The large Presbyterian party, apprehensive now of the independents, were most anxious to do so, anxious indeed as for their own existence, but it could not be. The unhappy Charles, in those final Hampton Court negotiations, shows himself as a man fatally incapable of being dealt with. A man who, once for all, could not and would not understand, whose thought did not in any measure represent to him the real fact of the matter, nay worse, whose word did not at all represent his thought. We may say this of him without cruelty, with deep pity rather, but it is true and undeniable. Forsaken there of all but the name of kingship, he still, finding himself treated with outward respect as a king, fancied that he might play off party against party, and smuggle himself into his old power by deceiving both. Alas, they both discovered that he was deceiving them. A man whose word will not inform you at all what he means or will do is not a man you can bargain with. You must get out of that man's way, or put him out of yours. The Presbyterians, in their despair, were still for believing Charles, though found false, unbelievable again and again. Not so Cromwell. For all our fighting, says he, we are to have a little bit of paper? No. In fact, everywhere we have to note the decisive practical eye of this man. How he drives toward the practical and practicable, has a genuine insight into what is fact. Such an intellect, I maintain, does not belong to a false man. The false man sees false shows, plausibilities, expediences. The true man is needed to discern even practical truth. Cromwell's advice about the Parliament's army early in the contest, how they were to dismiss their city tapsters, flimsy riotous persons, and choose substantial yeomen whose heart was in the work to be soldiers for them. This is advice by a man who saw. Fact answers if you see into fact. Cromwell's Ironsides were the embodiment of this insight of his. Men fearing God, and without any other fear. No more conclusively genuine set of fighters ever trod the soil of England or of any other land. Neither will we blame greatly that word of Cromwell's to them, which was so blamed. If the king should meet me in battle, I would kill the king. Why not? These words were spoken to men who stood as before a higher than kings. They had set more than their own lives on the cast. The Parliament may call it, in official language, a fighting for the king. But we, for our share, cannot understand that. To us it is no dilettante work, no sleek officiality. It is sheer rough death and earnest. They have brought it to the calling forth of war. Horrid internecine fight, man grappling with man in fire-eyed rage. The infernal element in man called forth to try it by that. Do that, therefore, since that is the thing to be done. The successes of Cromwell seem to me a very natural thing. Since he was not shot in battle, they were an inevitable thing. That such a man, with the eye to see, with the heart to dare, should advance from post to post, from victory to victory, till the Huntingdon farmer became, by whatever name you might call him, the acknowledged strongest man in England, virtually the King of England, requires no magic to explain it. Precisely here, however, lies the rub for Cromwell. His other proceedings have all found advocates and stand generally justified. But this dismissal of the Rump Parliament and assumption of the Protectorship is what no one can pardon him. He had fairly grown to be king in England, chief man of the victorious party in England. But it seems he could not do without the king's cloak, and sold himself to perdition in order to get it. Let us see a little how this was. England, Scotland, Ireland, all lying now subdued at the feet of the Puritan Parliament, the practical question arose, what was to be done with it? How will you govern these nations which Providence in a wondrous way has given up to your disposal? Clearly those 100 surviving members of the Long Parliament who sit there as supreme authority cannot continue forever to sit. What is to be done? It was a question which theoretical constitution builders may find easy to answer, but to Cromwell, looking there into the real practical facts of it, there could be none more complicated. He asked of the Parliament what it was they would decide upon. It was for the Parliament to say. Yet the soldiers too, however contrary to formula, they who had purchased this victory with their blood, it seemed to them that they also should have something to say in it. We will not, for all our fighting, have nothing but a little piece of paper. We understand that the law of God's gospel, to which he through us has given the victory, shall establish itself, or try to establish itself in this land. For 3 years, Cromwell says, this question had been sounded in the ears of the Parliament. They could make no answer, nothing but talk, talk. Perhaps it lies in the nature of parliamentary bodies. Perhaps no parliament could in such a case make any answer but even that of talk, talk. Nevertheless, the question must and shall be answered. You 60 men there, becoming fast odious, even despicable to the whole nation, whom the nation already calls Rump Parliament, you cannot continue to sit there. Who or what then is to follow? Free Parliament, right of election, constitutional formulas of one sort or the other. The thing is a hungry fact coming on us, which we must answer or be devoured by it. And who are you that prate of constitutional formulas, rights of Parliament? You have had to kill your king, to make pride's purges, to expel and banish by the law of the stronger whosoever would not let your cause prosper. There are but 50 or 60 of you left there, debating in these days. Tell us what we shall do, not in the way of formula, but of practicable fact. How they did finally answer remains obscure to this day. The diligent Godwin himself admits that he cannot make it out. The likeliest is that this poor Parliament still would not, and indeed could not, dissolve and disperse, that when it came to the point of actually dispersing, they again, for the 10th or 20th time, adjourned it, and Cromwell's patience failed him. But we will take the favourablest hypothesis ever started for the Parliament. The favourablest, though I believe it is not the true one, but too favourable. According to this version, at the uttermost crisis, when Cromwell and his officers were met on the one hand and the 50 or 60 Rump members on the other, it was suddenly told Cromwell that the Rump in its despair was answering in a very singular way, that in their splenetic, envious despair, to keep out the army at least, these men were hurrying through the House a kind of reform bill, Parliament to be chosen by the whole of England, equable electoral division into districts, free suffrage, and the rest of it. A very questionable, or indeed for them an unquestionable thing. Reform bill, free suffrage of Englishmen? Why, the Royalists themselves, silenced indeed but not exterminated, perhaps outnumber us. The great numerical majority of England was always indifferent to our cause, merely looked at it and submitted to it. It is in weight and force, not by counting of heads, that we are the majority. And now, with your formulas and reform bills, the whole matter sorely won by our swords shall again launch itself to sea, become a mere hope and likelihood, small even as a likelihood. And it is not a likelihood. It is a certainty which we have won by God's strength and our own right hands, and do now hold here. Cromwell walked down to these refractory members, interrupted them in that rapid speed of their reform bill, ordered them to begone and talk there no more. Can we not forgive him? Can we not understand him? John Milton, who looked on it all near at hand, could applaud him. The reality had swept the formulas away before it. I fancy most men who were realities in England might see into the necessity of that. The strong, daring man, therefore, has set all manner of formulas and logical superficialities against him, has dared appeal to the genuine fact of this England, whether it will support him or not. It is curious to see how he struggles to govern in some constitutional way, find some parliament to support him, but cannot. His first parliament, the one they call bare-bones parliament, is, so to speak, a convocation of the notables. From all quarters of England the leading ministers and chief Puritan officials nominate the men most distinguished by religious reputation, influence, and attachment to the true cause. These are assembled to shape out a plan. They sanctioned what was past, shaped as they could what was to come. They were scornfully called bare-bones Parliament. The man's name, it seems, was not Barebones, but Barbon, a good enough man. Nor was it a jest, their work. It was a most serious reality. A trial on the part of these Puritan notables how far the law of Christ could become the law of this England. There were men of sense among them, men of some quality. Men of deep piety, I suppose the most of them were. They failed, it seems, and broke down, endeavoring to reform the Court of Chancery. They dissolved themselves as incompetent, delivered up their power again into the hands of the Lord General Cromwell, to do with it what he liked and could. What will he do with it? The Lord General Cromwell, commander-in-chief of all the forces raised and to be raised. he hereby sees himself, at this unexampled juncture, as it were the one available authority left in England. Nothing between England and utter anarchy but him alone. Such is the undeniable fact of his position and England's, there and then. What will he do with it? After deliberation, he decides that he will accept it, will formally, with public solemnity, say and vow before God and men, "Yes, the fact is so, and I will do the best I can with it." Protectorship, instrument of government, these are the external forms of the thing, worked out and sanctioned as they could in the circumstances be, by the judges, by the leading official people, council of officers and persons of interest in the nation. And as for the thing itself, undeniably enough, at the pass matters had now come to, there was no alternative but anarchy or that. Puritan England might accept it or not, but Puritan England was, in real truth, saved from suicide thereby. I believe the Puritan people did, in an inarticulate, grumbling, yet on the whole grateful and real way, accept this anomalous act of Oliver's. At least he and they together made it good, and always better to the last. But in their parliamentary articulate way, they had their difficulties, and never knew fully what to say to it. Oliver's second Parliament, properly his first regular Parliament, chosen by the rule laid down in the instrument of government, did assemble and worked, but got before long into bottomless questions as to the Protector's right, as to usurpation, and so forth, and had at the earliest legal day to be dismissed. Cromwell's concluding speech to these men is a remarkable one. So likewise to his third Parliament, in similar rebuke for their pedantries and obstinacies. Most rude, chaotic all these speeches are, but most earnest-looking. You would say it was a sincere, helpless man, not used to speak the great inorganic thought of him, but to act it rather. A helplessness of utterance in such bursting fullness of meaning. He talks much about births of providence. All these changes, so many victories and events, were not forethoughts and theatrical contrivances of men, of me or of men. It is blind blasphemers that will persist in calling them so. He insists with a heavy, sulphurous, wrathful emphasis on this, as he well might, as if a Cromwell in that dark, huge game he had been playing, the world wholly thrown into chaos round him, had foreseen it all and played it all off like a pre-contrived puppet show by wood and wire. These things were foreseen by no man, he says. No man could tell what a day would bring forth. They were births of providence. God's finger guided us on, and we came at last to clear height of victory, God's cause triumphant in these nations, and you as a parliament could assemble together and say in what manner all this could be organized, reduced into rational feasibility among the affairs of men. You were to help with your wise counsel in doing that. You have had such an opportunity as no parliament in England ever had. Christ's law, the right and true, was to be in some measure made the law of this land. In place of that, you have got into your idle pedantries, constitutionalities, bottomless cavillings and questionings about written laws for my coming here, and would send the whole matter in chaos again because I have no notary's parchment, but only God's voice from the battle whirlwind for being president among you. That opportunity is gone, and we know not when it will return. You have had your constitutional logic, and Mammon's law, not Christ's law, rules yet in this land. God be judge between you and me. These are his final words to them. Take you your constitutional formulas in your hand, and I my informal struggles, purposes, realities, and acts, and God be judge between you and me. We said above what shapeless, involved, chaotic things the printed speeches of Cromwell are. Willfully ambiguous, unintelligible, say the most. A hypocrite shrouding himself in confused Jesuitic jargon. To me they do not seem so. I will say rather they afforded the first glimpses I could ever get into the reality of this Cromwell, nay, into the possibility of him. Try to believe that he means something, search lovingly what that may be. You will find a real speech lying imprisoned in these broken, rude, tortuous utterances, a meaning in the great heart of this inarticulate man. You will, for the first time, begin to see that he was a man, not an enigmatic chimera, unintelligible to you, incredible to you. The histories and biographies written of this Cromwell, written in shallow, skeptical generations that could not know or conceive of a deep, believing man, are far more obscure than Cromwell's speeches. You look through them only into the infinite vague of black and the inane. Heats and jealousies, says Lord Clarendon himself. Heats and jealousies, mere crabbed whims, theories, and crotchets. These induced slow, sober, quiet Englishmen to lay down their ploughs and work, and fly into red fury of confused war against the best conditioned of kings? Try if you can find that true. Skepticism writing about belief may have great gifts, but it is really ultra vires there. It is blindness laying down the laws of optics. Cromwell's third Parliament split on the same rock as his second. Ever the constitutional formula. How came you there? Show us some notary parchment. Blind pedants. Why, surely the same power which makes you a Parliament, that and something more, made me a protector. If my protectorship is nothing, what in the name of wonder is your parliamenteership, a reflex and creation of that? Parliaments having failed, there remained nothing but the way of despotism. Military dictators, each with his district to coerce the royalist and other gainsayers, to govern them, if not by act of Parliament, then by the sword. Formula shall not carry it, while the reality is here. I will go on protecting oppressed Protestants abroad, appointing just judges, wise managers at home, cherishing true gospel ministers, doing the best I can to make England a Christian England, greater than old Rome, the queen of Protestant Christianity. I, since you will not help me. I, while God leaves me life. Why did he not give it up, retire into obscurity again, since the law would not acknowledge him? Cry several. That is where they mistake. For him there was no giving of it up. Prime ministers have governed countries, Pitt, Bombal, Choiseul, and their word was a law while it held. But this prime minister was one that could not get resigned. Let him once resign, Charles Stuart and the Cavaliers waited to kill him, to kill the cause and him. Once embarked, there is no retreat, no return. This prime minister could retire no whither except into his tomb. One is sorry for Cromwell in his old days. His complaint is incessant of the heavy burden Providence has laid on him. Heavy, which he must bear till death. Old Colonel Hutchinson, as his wife relates it, Hutchinson, his old battle-mate, coming to see him on some indispensable business much against his will, Cromwell follows him to the door, in a most fraternal, domestic, conciliatory style, begs that he would be reconciled to him, his old brother-in-arms, says how much it grieves him to be misunderstood, deserted by true fellow-soldiers, dear to him from of old. The rigorous Hutchinson, cased in his republican formula, sullenly goes his way. And the man's head now white, his strong arm growing weary with its long work. I think always, too, of his poor mother, now very old, living in that palace of his, a right brave woman, as indeed they lived all in honest, God-fearing household there. If she heard a shot go off, she thought it was her son killed. He had come to her at least once a day, that she might see with her own eyes that he was yet living. The poor old mother! What had this man gained? What had he gained? He had a life of sore strife and toil to his last day. Fame, ambition, place in history? His dead body was hung in chains. His place in history forsooth, has been a place of ignominy, accusation, blackness, and disgrace. And here, this day, who knows if it is not rash in me to be among the first that ever ventured to pronounce him not a knave and liar, but a genuinely honest man. Peace to him. Did he not, in spite of all, accomplish much for us? We walk smoothly over his great, rough, heroic life. Step over his body sunk in the ditch there. We need not spurn it as we step on it. Let the hero rest. It was not to men's judgment that he appealed, nor have men judged him very well. End of section 36. Read by Jeffrey Wilson, Ames, Iowa, in March of 2023.
Section 37 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswaxcandle. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 11, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Cromwell's Rule in England, the Restoration, AD 1660, by John Richard Green. Cromwell saw that Puritanism had missed its aim. He saw that the attempt to secure spiritual results by material force had failed, as it always fails. It had broken down before the indifference and resentment of the great mass of the people, of men who were neither lawless nor enthusiasts, but who clung to the older traditions of social order, and whose humour and good sense revolted alike from the artificial conception of human life which Puritanism had formed, and from its effect to force such a conception on a people by law. It broke down, too, before the corruption of the Puritans themselves. It was impossible to distinguish between the saint and the hypocrite as soon as godliness became profitable. Ashley Cooper, a sceptic in religion and a profligate in morals, was among the loudest bagpipes of the squeaking train. Even among the really earnest Puritans, prosperity disclosed a pride, a worldliness, a selfish hardness, which had been hidden in the hour of persecution. What was yet more significant was the irreligious and sceptical temper of the younger generation, which had grown up amid the storms of the Civil War. The children, even of the leading Puritans, stood aloof from Puritanism. The eldest of Cromwell's sons made small pretensions to religion. Milton's nephews, though reared in his house, were writing satires against Puritan hypocrisy and contributing to collections of filthy songs. The two daughters of the great preacher, Stephen Marshall, were to figure as actresses on the infamous stage of the Restoration. The tone of the Protector's later speeches shows his consciousness that the ground was slipping from under his feet. He no longer dwells on the dream of a Puritan England, of a nation rising as a whole into a people of God. He falls back on the phrases of his youth, and the saints become again a peculiar people, a remnant, a fragment among the nation at large. But with the consciousness of failure in realizing his ideal of government, the charm of government was gone. And now to the weariness of power was added the weakness and feverish impatience of disease. Vigorous and energetic as Cromwell's life had seemed, his health was by no means as strong as his will. He had been struck down by intermittent fever in the midst of his triumphs, both in Scotland and in Ireland, and during the past year he had suffered from repeated attacks of it. "I have some infirmities upon me," he owned twice over in his speech at the reopening of the Parliament in January 1658 after an adjournment of 6 months. and his feverish irritability was quickened by the public danger. No supplies had been voted, and the pay of the army was heavily in arrear, while its temper grew more and more sullen at the appearance of the new constitution and the awakening of the royalist intrigues. Cromwell had believed that his military successes would secure compliance with his demands, but the temper of the Commons was even more irritable than his own. Under the terms of the new constitution, the members excluded in the preceding year took their places again in the House, and it was soon clear that the Parliament reflected the general mood of the nation. The tone of the Commons had become captious and quarrelsome. They still delayed the grant for supplies. Meanwhile, a hasty act of the Protector in giving to his nominees in the other House, as the new second chamber he had devised was called, the title of Lords, kindled a strife between the two houses which was busily fanned by Hasoreg and other opponents of the government. It was contended that the other House had, under the new constitution, simply judicial and not legislative powers. Such a contention struck at once at Cromwell's work of restoring the old political forms of English life, and the reappearance of parliamentary strife threw him at last, says an observer at his court, into a rage and passion, like unto madness. What gave weight to it was the growing strength of the Royalist party, and its hopes of a coming rising. Such a rising had in fact been carefully prepared, and Charles, with a large body of Spanish troops, drew to the coast of Flanders to take advantage of it. His hopes were above all encouraged by the strife in the Commons, and their manifest dislike of the system of the Protectorate. It was this that drove Cromwell to action. Summoning his coach by a sudden impulse, the Protector drove on, February the 4th, with a few guards to Westminster, and setting aside the remonstrance of Fleetwood, summoned the two houses to his presence. "I do dissolve this Parliament," he ended a speech of angry rebuke, "and let God be judge between you and me." Fatal as was the error, for the moment all went well. The army was reconciled by the blow levelled at its opponents, and a few murmurers who appeared in its ranks were weeded out by a careful remodelling. The triumphant officers avowed to stand or fall with His Highness. The danger of a royalist rising vanished before a host of addresses from the counties. Great news, too, came from abroad, where victory in Flanders and the cession of Dunkirk in June set the seal on Cromwell's glory. But the fever crept steadily on, and his looks told the tale of death to the Quaker, Fox, who met him riding in Hampton Court Park. "Before I came to him," he says, as he rode at the head of his life guards, "I saw and felt a waft of death go forth against him, and when I came to him, he looked like a dead man." In the midst of his triumph, Cromwell's heart was heavy, in fact, with a sense of failure. He had no desire to play the tyrant, nor had he any belief in the permanence of mere tyranny. He clung desperately to the hope of bringing over the country to his side. He had hardly dissolved the Parliament before he was planning the summons of another, and angry at the opposition which his council offered to the project, "I'll make my own resolutions," he said gloomily to his household. "I can no longer satisfy myself to sit still, make myself guilty of the loss of all the honest party and of the nation itself." But before his plans could be realized, the overtaxed strength of the Protector suddenly gave way. Early in August 1658, his sickness took a more serious form. He saw too clearly the chaos into which his death would plunge England to be willing to die. "Do not think that I shall die," he burst out with feverish energy to the physicians gathered around him. "Say not I have lost my reason. I tell you the truth. I know it from better authority than any you can have from Galen or Hippocrates. It is the answer of God himself to our prayers." Prayer indeed rose from every side for his recovery. But death grew steadily nearer, till even Cromwell felt that his hour was come. "I would be willing to live," the dying man murmured, "to be further serviceable to God and his people. But my work is done. Yet God will be with his people." A storm which tore roofs from houses and levelled huge trees in every forest seemed a fitting prelude to the passing away of his mighty spirit. 3 days later, on September the 3rd, the day which had witnessed his victories at Worcester and Dunbar, Cromwell quietly breathed his last. So absolute, even in death, was his sway over the minds of men, that, to the wonder of the excited royalists, even a doubtful nomination on his deathbed was enough to secure the peaceful succession of his son, Richard Cromwell. Many, in fact, who had rejected the authority of his father, submitted peaceably to the new protector. Their motives were explained by Baxter, the most eminent among the Presbyterian ministers, in an address to Richard, which announced his adhesions. "I observe," he says, "that the nation generally rejoice in your peaceable entrance upon the government. Many are persuaded that you have been strangely kept from participating in any of our late bloody contentions, that God might make you the healer for our breaches, and employ you in that temple work which David himself might not be honoured with, though it was in his mind, because he shed blood abundantly and made great wars." The new protector was a weak and worthless man, but the bulk of the nation were content to be ruled by one who was at any rate no soldier, no Puritan, and no innovator. Richard was known to be lax and worldly in his conduct, and he was believed to be conservative and even royalist in heart. The tide of reaction was felt even in his council. Their first act was to throw aside one of the greatest of Cromwell's reforms, and to fall back in the summons which they issued for a new parliament on the old system of election. It was felt far more keenly in the tone of the new House of Commons when it met in January 1659. The Republicans, under Vane, backed adroitly by the members who were secretly royalists, fell hotly on Cromwell's system. The fiercest attack of all came from Sir Ashley Cooper, a Dorsetshire gentleman who had changed sides in the Civil War, had fought for the king and then for the Parliament, had been a member of Cromwell's council, and had of late ceased to be a member of it. His virulent invective on His Highness of deplorable memory, who with fraud and force deprived you of your liberty when living and entailed slavery on you at his death, was followed by an equally virulent invective against the army. "They have not only subdued their enemies," said Cooper, "but the masters who raised and maintained them. They have not only conquered Scotland and Ireland, but rebellious England too, and there suppressed a malignant party of magistrates and laws." The army was quick with its reply. Already in the preceding November it had shown its suspicion of the new government by demanding the appointment of a soldier as general in the place of the new protector, who had assumed the command. The tone of the Council of Officers now became so menacing that the Commons ordered the dismissal of all officers who refused to engage, not to disturb or interrupt the free meetings of Parliament. Richard ordered the Council of Officers to dissolve. Their reply was a demand for the dissolution of the Parliament, and with this demand, on April the 22nd, Richard was forced to comply. The purpose of the army, however, was still to secure a settled government, and setting aside the new protector, whose weakness was now evident, they resolved to come to a reconciliation with the Republican party, and to recall the fragment of the Commons whom they had expelled from St. Stephen's in 1653. The arrangement was quickly brought about, and in May, of the 160 members who had continued to sit after the king's death, about 90 returned to their seats and resumed the administration of affairs. The continued exclusion of the members who had been purged from the House in 1648 proved that no real intention existed of restoring a legal rule, and the soldiers trusted that the rump which they had restored to power would be bound to them by the growing danger both to republicanism and to religious liberty. But not even their passion for these causes could make men endure the rule of the sword. The House was soon at strife with the soldiers. In spite of Vane's counsels, it proposed a reform of the officers, and though a royalist rising in Cheshire during August threw the disputants for a moment together, the struggle revived as the danger passed away. A new hope indeed filled men's minds. Not only was the nation sick of military rule, but the army, unconquerable so long as it held together, at last showed signs of division. In Ireland and Scotland, the troops protested against the attitude of their English comrades, and Monk, the commander of the Scottish army, threatened to march on London and free the Parliament from their pressure. The knowledge of these divisions encouraged Haselrig and his coadjutors in the Commons to demand the dismissal of Fleetwood and Lambert from their commands. They answered in October by driving the Parliament again from Westminster, and by marching under Lambert to the north to meet the army under Monk. Lambert, however, suffered himself to be lured into inaction by negotiations, while Monk gathered a convention at Edinburgh and strengthened himself with money and recruits. His attitude was enough to rouse England to action. Portsmouth closed its gates against the delegates of the soldiers. The fleet declared against them. So rapidly did the tide of feeling rise throughout the country that the army at the close of December was driven to undo the work by recalling the Rump. But the concession only aided the force of resistance by showing the weakness of the tyranny which England was resolute to throw off. Lambert's men fell from him, and finding his path clear, Monk, without revealing his purport, advanced rapidly to Coldstream and crossed the border in the first days of 1660. His action broke the spell of terror which had weighed upon the country. The cry of "A free Parliament!" ran like fire through the country. Not only Fairfax, who appeared in arms in Yorkshire, but the ships on the Thames and the mobs which thronged the streets of London caught up the cry. Still steadily advancing, but lavishing protestations of loyalty to the Rump, while he accepted petitions for a free Parliament, Monk, on February the 3rd, entered London unopposed. From the moment of his entry, the restoration of the Stuarts became inevitable. The army, resolute as it still remained from the maintenance of the cause, was deceived by Monk's declarations of loyalty to it, and rendered powerless by his adroit dispersion of the troops over the country. At the instigation of Ashley Cooper, those who remained of the members who had been excluded from the House of Commons in 1648 again forced their way into Parliament, and at once resolved on a dissolution and the election of a new House of Commons. The dissolution in March was followed by a last struggle of the army for its old supremacy. Lambert escaped from the Tower and called his fellow soldiers to arms, but he was hotly pursued, overtaken, and routed near Daventry. And on April 25th, the new House, which bears the name of the Convention, assembled at Westminster. It had hardly taken the solemn League and Covenant, which showed its Presbyterian temper, and its leaders had only begun to draw up terms on which the king's restoration might be assented to, when they found that Monk was in negotiation with the exiled court. All exaction of terms was now impossible. A declaration from Breda, in which Charles promised a general pardon, religious toleration, and satisfaction to the army, was received with a burst of national enthusiasm. The old constitution was restored by a solemn vote of the Convention, that according to the ancient and fundamental laws of this kingdom, the government is, and ought to be, by King, Lords, and Commons. The king was at once invited to hasten to his realm, and on May 25th Charles landed at Dover and made his way amid the shouts of a great multitude to Whitehall. "It is my own fault," laughed the new king with characteristic irony, "that I had not come back sooner, for I find nobody who does not tell me he had always longed for my return." In his progress to the capital, Charles passed and reviewed the soldiers assembled on Blackheath. Betrayed by their general, abandoned by their leaders, surrounded as they were by a nation in arms, the gloomy silence of their ranks awed even the careless king with a sense of danger. But none of the victories of the new model was so glorious as the victory which it won over itself. Quietly and without a struggle, as men who bowed to the inscrutable will of God, the farmers and traders who had dashed Rupert's chivalry to pieces on Naseby Field, who had scattered at Worcester the army of the aliens, and driven into helpless flight the sovereign that now came to enjoy his own again, who had renewed beyond sea the glories of Crécy and Agincourt, had mastered the Parliament, had brought a king to justice in the block, had given laws to England, and held even Cromwell in awe, became farmers and traders again, and were known among their fellow men by no other sign than their great soberness and industry. And with them Puritanism laid down the sword. It ceased from the long attempt to build up a kingdom of God by force and violence, and fell back on its truer work of building up a kingdom of righteousness in the hearts and consciences of men. It was from the moment of its seeming fall that its real victory began. As soon as the wild orgy of the Restoration was over, men began to see that nothing that was really worthy of the work in Puritanism had been undone. The revels of Whitehall, the scepticism and debauchery of courtiers, the corruption of statesmen, left the mass of Englishmen what Puritanism had made them: serious, earnest, sober in life and conduct, firm in their love of Protestantism and of freedom. In the Revolution of 1688, Puritanism did the work of civil liberty which had failed to do in that of 1642. It wrought out, through Wesley and the revival of the 18th century, the work of religious reform which its earlier efforts had only thrown back for 100 years. Slowly but steadily it introduced its own seriousness and purity into English society, English literature, English politics. The history of English progress since the Restoration on its moral and spiritual sides has been the history of Puritanism. End of section 37.
Section 38 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 11, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Cromwell's Rule in England, The Restoration, A.D. 1660, by Samuel Pepys. May 22, 1660. News brought that the two dukes are coming on board, which, by and by, they did, in a Dutch boat, the Duke of York in yellow trimmings, the Duke of Gloucester in grey and red. My lord. Footnote: Sir Edward Montague, afterward Earl of Sandwich, Pepys' patron. He was in command of the English fleet. End of footnote. Went in a boat to meet them, the captain, myself, and others, standing at the entering port. So soon as they were entered, we shot the guns off round the fleet. After that, they went to view the ship all over, and were most exceedingly pleased with it. They seemed to be very fine gentlemen. After that done, upon the quarter-deck table, under the awning, the Duke of York and my lord, Mr. Coventry, and I spent an hour at allotting to every ship their service in their return to England, which being done, they went to dinner, where the table was very full, the two dukes at the upper end, my lord Opdon Neat on one side, and my lord on the other. 2 guns given to every man while he was drinking the king's health, and so likewise to the duke's health. I took down Monsieur d'Esquire to the great cabin below, and dined with him in state, along with only 1 or 2 friends of his. All dinner the harper belonging to Captain Sparling played to the dukes. After dinner, the dukes and my lord to sea, the vice and rear admirals and I in a boat after them. After that done, they made to the shore in the Dutch boat that brought them, and I got into the boat with them. But the shore was full of people to expect their coming. When we came near the shore, my lord left them, and come into his own boat, and Pen and I with him, my lord being very well pleased with his day's work. By the time we came on board again, news is sent us that the king is on shore. So my lord fired all his guns round twice, and all the fleet after him. The gun over against my cabin I fired myself to the king, which was the first time that he had been saluted by his own ships since this change. But holding my head too much over the gun, I had almost spoiled my right eye. Nothing in the world but giving a guns almost all this day. In the evening, we began to remove cabins. I to the carpenter's cabin, and Dr. Clerk with me. Many of the king's servants came on board tonight, and so many Dutch of all sorts came to see the ship till it was quite dark, that we could not pass by one another, which was a great trouble to us all. This afternoon Mr. Downing, who was knighted yesterday by the king, was here on board, and had a ship for his passage into England with his lady and servants. By the same token, he called me to him when I was going to write the order, to tell me that I must write him Sir G. Downing. My lord lay in the round-house tonight. This evening I was late writing a French letter by my lord's order to Monsieur Ra, ambassadeur de Denmark à La Haye, which my lord signed in bed. 23rd. In the morning come infinity of people on board from the king to go along with him. My lord, Mr. Crewe, and others go on shore to meet the king as he comes off from shore, where Sir R. Stainer, bringing his majesty into the boat, I hear that his majesty did, with a great deal of affection, kiss my lord upon his first meeting. The king, with the 2 dukes and Queen of Bohemia, Princess Royal, and Prince of Orange, come on board, where I, in their coming, kissed the king's, queen's, and princess' hands, having done the other before. Infinite shooting off of the guns, and that in a disorder on purpose, which was better than if it had been otherwise. All day nothing but lords and persons of honour on board, that we were exceeding full. Dined in a great deal of state, the royal company by themselves in the coach, which was a blessed sight to see. After dinner, the king and duke altered the name of some of the ships, viz., the Naseby into Charles, the Richard, James, the Speaker, Mary. That done, the Queen, Princess Royal, and Prince of Orange took leave of the king, and the Duke of York went on board the London, and the Duke of Gloucester the Swiftsure. Which done, we weighed anchor, and with a fresh gale and most happy weather we set sail for England. All the afternoon the king walked here and there, up and down, quite contrary to what I thought him to have been, very active and stirring. Upon the quarter-deck he fell into discourse of his escape from Worcester, where it made me ready to weep to hear the stories that he told of his difficulties that he had passed through, as is travelling 4 days and 3 nights on foot, every step up to his knees in dirt, with nothing but a green coat and a pair of country breeches on, and a pair of country shoes that made him so sore all over his feet that he could scarce stir. Yet he was forced to run away from a miller and other company that took them for rogues. His sitting at table at one place, where the master of the house that had not seen him in 8 years did know him, but kept it private. When at the same table there was one that had been of his own regiment at Worcester, could not know him, but made him drink the king's health, and said that the king was at least 4 fingers higher than he. At another place he was by some servants of the house made to drink, that they might know that he was not a Roundhead, which they swore he was. In another place at his inn, the master of the house, as the king was standing with his hands upon the back of a chair by the fireside, kneeled down and kissed his hand, privately, saying that he would not ask him who he was, but bid God bless him whither he was going. Then the difficulties in getting a boat to get into France, where he was fain to plot with the master thereof to keep his design from the foreman and a boy, which was all the ship's company, and so get to Fécamp in France. At Rouen he looked so poorly that the people went into the rooms before he went away to see whether he had not stole something or other. In the evening I went up to my lord to write letters for England, which we sent away with word of our coming by Mr. Edward Pickering. The king supped alone in the coach. After that I got a dish, and we four supped in my cabin, as at noon. About bedtime, my Lord Bartlett, who I had offered my service to before, sent for me to get him a bed, who, with much ado, I did get to bed to my Lord Middlesex in the great cabin below, but I was truly troubled before I could dispose of him, and quit myself of him. So to my cabin again, where the company still was, and were talking more of the king's difficulties, as how he was fain to eat a piece of bread and cheese out of a poor body's pocket, how, at a Catholic house, he was fain to lie in the priest's hole a good while in the house for his privacy. After that, our company broke up. We have the Lord's commissioners on board us, and many others. Under sail all night, and most glorious weather. 24th. Up, and made myself as fine as I could, with the linen stockings on and wide cannons that I bought the other day at Hague. Extraordinary press of noble company, and great mirth all the day. There dined with me in my cabin, that is, the carpenters, Dr. Earle and Mr. Hollis, the king's chaplains, Dr. Scarborough, Dr. Quarterman, and Dr. Clerk, physicians, Mr. Duray and Mr. Fox, both very fine gentlemen, the king's servants, where we have brave discourse. Walking upon the decks were persons of honour all the afternoon, among others. Thomas Killigrew, a merry droll, but a gentleman of great esteem with the king, who told us many merry stories. At supper the 3 doctors of physic again at my cabin, where I put Dr. Scarborough in mind of what I heard him say, that children do, in every day's experience, look several ways with both their eyes, till custom teaches them otherwise, and that we do now see but with one eye, our eyes looking in parallel lines. After this discourse, I was called to write a pass for my Lord Mandeville to take up horses to London, which I wrote in the king's name, and carried it to him to sign, which was the first and only one that he ever signed in the ship Charles. To bed, coming in sight of land a little before night. 25th. By the morning we were come close to the land, and everybody made ready to get on shore. The king and the 2 dukes did eat their breakfast before they went, and there being set some ship's diet, they ate of nothing else but peas and pork and boiled beef. Dr. Clerk, who ate with me, told me how the king had given £50 to Mr. Shepley for my lord's servants, and £500 among the officers and common men of the ship. I spoke to the Duke of York about business, who called me Pepys by name, and upon my desire did promise me his future favour. Great expectation of the king's making some knights, but there was none. About noon, though the brigantine that Beale made was there ready to carry him, yet he would go in my lord's barge with the 2 dukes. Our captain steered, and my lord went along bare with him. I went, and Mr. Mansell, and one of the king's footmen, and a dog that the king loved, in a boat by ourselves, and so got on shore when the king did, who was received by General Monk with all imaginable love and respect at his entrance upon the land of Dover. Infinite the crowd of people and the horsemen, citizens and noblemen of all sorts. The mayor of the town came and gave him his white staff, the badge of his place, which the king did give him again. The mayor also presented him from the town a very rich Bible, which he took, and said it was the thing that he loved above all things in the world. A canopy was provided for him to stand under, which he did, and talked a while with General Monk and others, and so into a stately coach there set for him, and so away through the town toward Canterbury, without making any stay at Dover. The shouting and joy expressed by all is past imagination. Seeing that my lord did not stir out of his barge, I got into a boat, and so into his barge. My lord almost transported with joy that he had done all this without any the least blur or obstruction in the world, that could give offence to any, and with the great honor he thought it would be to him. End of section 38. Read by Anita Hibbard, January 9th, 2023. End of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 11, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd.